Hey everyone, welcome back to Project Honesty, a podcast designed for young adults, by a young adult, to gain brutally honest, friend-like advice, as well as provide a platform for young adults to form opinions, color outside of the lines, take deep dives into current events, and most importantly, have fun. This is Project Honesty, navigating reality with real conversations and diverse opinions. Hey, I am so happy to be back for episode 12 of Project Honesty, and the last episode in my Turtle Island Talk series, which is crazy to think about that I've been doing this series for over a month now. I'm so happy that you guys have been here to support me through this series. It's definitely been a lot of research, a lot of upsetting facts, but it was definitely an important series to make, create, write, and spread. And so with that, I am excited to be finalizing this series with an episode about issues that Indigenous women face. Now, on my channel, I've talked about feminism before. I've talked about female issues that impact all women, but it is important to me to recognize the issues that Indigenous women specifically face. In honor of May 5th, which was Red Dress Day, which is a day to honor Indigenous women, girls, children, and Two-Spirit people who have not returned home. That was definitely a big inspiration to today's episode. Just a little bit of a trigger warning. Today, we're going to be talking a lot about sexual violence, rape, and we're going to be looking at some upsetting statistics around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We're also going to be mentioning a little bit of substance abuse, which has kind of been a topic that I've mentioned on this series before. But again, just wanted to preface this by saying that there will be slight mentions of substance abuse. And another big thing that we'll be mentioning here is, of course, generational trauma. We've learned about intergenerational trauma and how it impacts Indigenous communities now. And so I just want to give that warning for today's last Turtle Island Talk series. Why is this episode important? The statistics around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls rise every single day in Canada. The CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, has a website stating the names, pictures, and ages of the current missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls cases known in Canada. I say known because a lot of these cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls go unreported. There is a lot of factors that contribute to the unreportedness of these situations, and we'll get into a little bit about that later. And at the moment, the number of reported cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls of all ages is 307. This number is, of course, subject to change. Why? Well, the majority of cases do not go resolved. Cases are rarely taken seriously by authorities, and the authorities and government aren't making the effort to get these cases solved. But there is some racial discrimination when it comes to getting cases of missing and murdered women and girls in general solved. And when it comes to Indigenous women and girls, it seems like their cases are pushed under the rug and forgotten about. In today's episode, we will be covering the stats around how Indigenous women and girls end up in the cycle of abuse, the percentage of Indigenous women who experience intimate partner violence. We're also going to be looking at how media has been used to spread awareness about this very serious issue and what we can do to help this issue. First, I want to start with the percentage of Indigenous women in Canada, just so we know what we're working with. Indigenous women in Canada make up a mere 4% of the female population in Canada. So, around half of Canada is female. Only 4% of that half is Indigenous women. So, very little of the population already is made up of Indigenous women. Indigenous women make up the 11% of missing female population cases in Canada, and they also make up 16% of all female homicide victims in Canada. According to the Assembly of First Nations, more than half of Indigenous women have experienced some form of physical assault, and around 46% of those same women have experienced sexual assault and sexual violence. These statistics already prove that Indigenous women are way more likely to experience some form of violence, whether it is sexual violence or non-sexual violence, compared to the only 1/3 of non-Indigenous women in Canada who have experienced that same violence. When it comes to partner and intimate partner violence, 13% of Indigenous women have suffered from intimate partner violence from a current or ex-partner, so someone that is known to them. And when it comes to sexual violence in general, it most commonly happens by someone you are known to. When it comes to the sexual violence that is suffered by many Indigenous women, so more than half of Indigenous women in Canada have suffered from some form of sexual violence, there is a lot to be learned from that situation. So I want to talk about a very, very good movie that showcases this issue of Indigenous women facing intimate partner violence on Indigenous reserves. If you haven't watched it before, I'm sorry, but I'm going to give a few spoilers on here. Actually, not a few. I'm going to spoil the whole thing, but it's okay because I've watched it twice. It is a really, really amazing show. It's called Wind River. It is available on Netflix, and I think it's available on Prime Video as well. Talking about this show, I'm going to give away a lot of spoilers, because Wind River is an amazing show that really, really highlights the issues that Indigenous women face that not a lot of people actually know about. So the synopsis of Wind River is a wildlife officer is in the snowy forest backcountry of a Wyoming reserve. Wind River Indian Reserve is what it was called. And he comes across a young woman lying dead in the snow. Her body lies frostbitten, bloody, and lifeless. The officer pairs up with the FBI to solve the death of the woman. After an autopsy, it is revealed that the woman was assaulted and raped. The film hides nothing from reality. It shows how Indigenous women end up getting raped on reserve, but also through businesses around reserves and in small towns. In Wind River, we can see how fatal these assaults can end up. So after the woman is raped by several men at a construction site near her reserve, she escapes by running through the freezing, snowy fields of Wyoming, with no shoes, a small coat, and thin pajama pants. Due to the outside conditions not being met with proper protection, she ends up fainting and dying from her lungs being frozen, battling death as she was running for her life trying to escape sexual violence. Now, Wind River is not based off of a true story, but it is based off the true reality countless of Indigenous women face every year on and off reserve land in Canada and the United States. Why did I like this movie? Well, it didn't avoid reality. It did not beat around the bush when it came to issues surrounding the sexual violence that Indigenous women face. It showed the real, raw, and upsetting life that is many Indigenous women's reality in Canada. And the only way to spread awareness about this issue is through honesty. Watching the reality of this situation is the best way to understand and empathize and actually know why you should care about it. I will say that the movie is very, very upsetting. It shows the rape when the woman got raped on the construction site. It shows her death, and that is upsetting, but I think that the story behind it and how we see authorities and government trying to deal with this situation is way more important than all of the gory stuff. And it really gives you a great insight into what reality is like for a lot of Indigenous women. Now, why are Indigenous women more likely to face sexual violence leading to being missing or murdered? This is a very complex question, but there's a few answers that contribute to them facing sexual violence that again leads to either being missing or dead. One of the biggest factors is these women tend to travel long distances, especially if they live on reserve land. They are far away from post-secondary education or work, and so they tend to travel a lot. And I think in that travel, these women end up couch surfing or being with people that they shouldn't be, and that is a really big segue into sexual violence that can happen towards Indigenous women. Now, another thing is generational trauma. As we know, it's a contributing factor to a lot of problems Indigenous communities face, but especially for Indigenous women. And with the substance abuse, addiction, and foster care use that comes out of this generational trauma, abuse is not something uncommon to Indigenous women. Being homeless is also another contributing factor into why many Indigenous women experience this sexual violence. Now, if you don't know much about Indigenous culture, you wouldn't know why women are so important to Indigenous culture and the power that they have. When it comes to Indigenous communities and culture, women hold a significant amount of power and leadership within these communities. They are the givers of life, and they also take care of that life. They are also the caregivers of tradition and family culture and the interconnectedness of traditional Indigenous ways of having a family. As well, they are the traditional leaders of the household. They keep everything together. They are there to support their family through anything. Another thing is that water is very sacred to Indigenous women. Indigenous women are known as the protectors of water. And so when you see on the news, when there's an issue when it comes to water, a lot of Indigenous women are typically consulted on those issues because they are the protectors of it, because water is sacred. And since women bear the right to carry sacred life, they also bear the right to care about water. So like water is sacred, women are sacred in Indigenous culture. So how can we support Indigenous women who have or have had suffered from sexual violence or abuse? And how can we support others through a loss of an Indigenous family member due to sexual violence? There's a lot of charities, so some charities include No More Silence or No More Stolen Sisters. These groups advocate and honor Indigenous women, girls, trans people, and Two-Spirit people who have not returned home due to this type of violence. Safe Passage is another one. Now, these are all Canadian organizations. There is definitely a lot more in the States as well, but these are just specifically for Canada. So Safe Passage advocates for missing women and for their cases to be taken seriously by authorities, which is something we know doesn't happen very often. Another way to help is read their names. So if you Google, so earlier I mentioned a CBC website that will bring you to see these women's names and faces. If you Google cbc.ca/missingandmurdered/, it'll bring you to that exact website. So it is cbc.ca/missingandmurdered/. That website is where you can look at their faces and read their names and see how many women have suffered. Another way to help is reading and research the calls to actions to end the suffering of Indigenous women and girls. There is a 52-page call to justice document available on Google. I forgot how to look that up. If you just look up call to justice document and then missing and murdered Indigenous women behind that, it should bring you to a PDF about all of the calls to action, bring it towards the government to aid the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women. There's also support lines available, so if you are struggling and need immediate emotional support surrounding a loved one associated with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, you can call 1-844-413-6649. That's 1-844-413-6649. You can also visit a website. You can visit the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. There's a lot of information that I wasn't able to put in this episode on that website. It is very good, and it focuses heavily on the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people in Canada. So those are all ways to help. Now, since this is the last episode in the Turtle Island Talk series, I just want to mention what we've learned through this 4-part series. We've learned it's important to listen, learn, acknowledge, advocate, research, and empathize with Indigenous communities as a way to contribute to truth and reconciliation. Now, as we know, Indigenous issues are very complex, and history continues to contribute to modern issues within Indigenous communities. And we know that truth and reconciliation takes time, effort, honesty, recognition, and very, very, very hard truths. But unfortunately, that is our collective reality and something that we cannot avoid. I hope this series gave you many insights into the depths of Indigenous issues in Canada and how they affect Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. I really enjoyed making this series. Indigenous issues is definitely a passion of mine, and I really, really enjoy researching about this topic. And I hope that even if you haven't listened to all the episodes on this series or you didn't listen to episodes fully, I hope you learned something. That is just my goal, and that is my way of contributing to truth and reconciliation, is getting the word out there about these issues that are really, really hard to understand when reading about them. And so when I have the ability and the platform to talk about them, I will. And so that is really, really exciting for me. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Project Honesty. You can find Project Honesty on Spotify at Project Honesty or on YouTube at Project_Honesty. And to keep up to date with new episodes, you can head over to Project Honesty's Instagram, which is at Project_Honesty24. We also have a TikTok, which is at Project.Honesty. And to help spread this podcast everywhere, tell a friend or share with family about Project Honesty and direct them over to the Instagram, TikTok, Spotify, or YouTube to help them learn more. The more listeners, the bigger the family. Thank you. Bye-bye.